How could you decolonize art history if you're thinking about Islamic art history?
You're dealing not just with art and culture, you're dealing with capitalism. To me, the question of how to decolonize has everything to do with how a museum engages with the broader economy. So what's the function of museum?
Welcome to the Afikra podcast. My name is Mikey Mhenna. Today on this series, we have Wendy Shaw, who is a scholar of art history of Islamic cultures. She's the author of several books, including What is Islamic Art? Islamic under quotations, Between Religion and Perception. Wendy, welcome to Afikra.
Thank you so much for your invitation. Looking forward to talking with you.
Yeah, me too. Okay, cool. I want to ask you, before we get into the subject of the book and sort of the subject of the conversation, what got you into this type of stuff? What got you into art history more broadly, but also sort of what compelled you to write a book about Islamic art?
It's a long question. I think the shortest way I can answer it is that when I was in high school, there was a lot of pressure on women to go into sciences. So it was sort of like, if you could do math, you should go into science. And being a nice young student, I went into biochemistry at a science and engineering college. And I did not love it. I was doing okay, but I didn't love it. And it wasn't my natural language. And I ended up transferring to a women's college and being a art major with a focus in ceramics and drawing. And I had no idea what to do with that. So then I accidentally met my advisor, Rini Bierman at UCLA, when she was traveling through Turkey, where I was with my family. And she invited me to come and do an MA with her. And I thought, well, that sounds interesting. I'm kind of interested in Sufism. I have no clue what to do with my life. I'm 20 years old. And so I ended up in grad school, and she was sort of like, she knows Turkish. She's smart. I was very clueless. I knew nothing about art history, like literally nothing. And we did a lot of critical theory. And I expected from the word Islamic art history, I expected it would be understanding about Islam with the vehicle of art. And basically what I learned was that Islam wasn't part of Islamic art history. That is, it was about urban planning, it was about material culture, it was about the politics of patronage, materiality, representing of narratives, but it was really much more about locating the patronage in relation to manuscript painting and so on. And I really didn't like Islamic art history. Fortunately, Rini Bierman was really interested in critical theory, and a lot of her courses dealt with critical theory. And so I became exposed to post-colonial theory. And of course, this is the 90s when this is really under discussion and being incorporated into art history for the first time. There were courses at UCLA that were about the history of museums. And so I was able to move towards thinking about more contemporary subjects. So I thought I would work on contemporary Turkey, and I'm part Turkish, so that's very much part of my own personal background. And every time I started to work on contemporary Turkey, I'd get stuck in the 19th century. So my first book was about museums in the Ottoman Empire, and I was interested in how museums function outside of a Western setting in a way that's both adopting Western conventions and also resisting colonialism at the same time. My second book was about painting, basically more or less during the same era. And again, what does it mean to adopt a practice of painting, and mostly oil painting, in a culture where that practice doesn't really have an audience? It's something that's from outside that you're trying to use to represent yourself. Because for me, there are a lot of internal contradictions in that. And so at that time, there were neither people working on non-Western museums, nor were there very many people working on modern art of the Middle East. And point blank, art historians would say, you'll never get a job. You can't, there's no such thing as a modern art of the region. And that was just a given. Lots of things happened in between. I was in Near Eastern Languages and Cultures at Ohio State for a while. Ohio wasn't the best place for me to be. I moved to Turkey. I worked there in 6 years. I was at 4 institutions. And eventually there was a position in world art history in Switzerland, and I ended up moving there in 2009. At that time, I had a baby, and I needed to have a new subject to do research on. I was no longer living in Turkey. I no longer really wanted to focus on Turkey because I figured, why should Swiss people be interested in Turkey? And I was trying to find a reasonable subject that I could do remotely. And really what I wanted to do was, what's the role of Islam in Islamic art? That was where I wanted to go. And there were a lot of discussions at the time about the figurative imagery being banned and so on. And really, I find that to be a terribly boring discussion. I love what Christy Gruber's done about it, but if you just start with, well, they're not being Muslim when they're having images, not that Christy does that. I love the work she's doing. But the general understanding of you either don't have images or you're being Islamic is very reductive. And I didn't really have the training or the background to think about what is the Islam in Islamic art. But I also didn't see anybody taking up this question, which was really what I had originally wanted to do. And there was a process of giving myself permission to undertake that exploration and at the very least suggest what could be possible through such exploration and, dip my foot in an enormous sea. So I'm very happy with what I was able to do. I think that I was able to make a cohesive argument that there's an intellectual substrate to rethink the basis of what we conceive of under this rubric of art, whether we can think of it completely within the rubric of history, what it means to write about things that are created and perceived. I don't think that what I wrote is the only answer to those questions, but what I wanted to do, and I hope that I've done, is open a door that, moves outside of art history and also moves outside of Islamic studies from a perspective of art history. So sort of is in that gap. But I also hope that there are many other ways to answer those questions.
Okay, let me ask you a basic question. And I want you to imagine an audience of teenagers, okay, you're speaking to. And me being an intellectual teenager. So I'll pose one of the first questions that you ask in the book, which is, can art be Islamic, right? Can something, visual that you perceive, not necessarily visual, something that you perceive, can it be connected to a theology?
Okay, so the way I would try to describe this to somebody would be through storytelling. Because one of the things I really learned in writing my book is that while we tend to express things by making arguments, what actually sticks with people is stories. And so the story I would tell in relation to how to think of an object as Islamic, as part of an Islamic culture, is through an experience I had. I had been reading Gudrun Nijipolu's work on the geometries of the Topkapi Palace. And that evening I went for a walk, and it was dusk. And so it was that beautiful the sky was that beautiful lapis color, in which everything, when you look up, gets flattened because there isn't a lot of light. I was walking under an acacia tree, and an acacia tree is one of those trees which has little branches about that long, and then little tiny leaves that come off from those branches. And they make an amazing geometric form. So I was walking under a tree and I looked up and I thought, it's a dome. And then I thought, no, it's a tree. And I thought, no, it's a dome. And what I realized was that I'm used to thinking about a tree as something that we see from far away. It has a trunk and it has a tree on top of it. But actually, the way we most effectively experience trees is when we're under the tree. We enjoy the shadow, we enjoy the patterns, we enjoy the leaves. And so what I realized was that I was accustomed to looking at the tree from far away. But actually, what I needed to do was look at the tree from a different way of viewing it, in which the tree wasn't the tree over there, but the tree was this set of patterns and mathematical sets, and that actually a dome was a representation of the concept of a tree. And in some ways, it was a more true representation than the literal view of what any given tree might look like. So that's how I would describe it. If you're used to thinking about a tree as a particular tree that has these particular branches, I want it to be an individual, then you have a way of looking from outside that's typical of the conventions that have developed in representation in Europe in a Christian context. And there's history to that context. If you were looking at that tree from a discursive space, which is accustomed to a lot of geometric patterning, which also isn't essential to Islam, but which is a practice which evolved and which was discussed in terms of Islamic meanings over a long period of time, then your experience of the tree is something else.
This idea of this sort of framework that you're proposing, what does it leave out of the definition of what Islamic art is? Like, we've been talking about what Islamic is. What isn't Islamic art?
What isn't Islamic art? I mean, in some ways, I think that,
like, if I'm looking at something, let's say I go to a museum and I see something.
Mm-hmm.
How can I come to the conclusion that what I'm looking at is not Islamic art?
That's such an interesting question. And I think that the issue is that it's not about what's in the object. It's in the discursive frameworks of that object. It's somewhere between the discursive framework in which that object emerges and the discursive framework that you come to the object with. So say, most simply, that you're looking at a painting of Christ on the cross, right? So a typical crucifixion. The language of that painting is deeply embedded in the understanding of suffering as a relationship with believers, the belief in the Trinity, the belief in resurrection, and so on. For somebody who is steeped in Islamic discourses, they of course know who Christ is. And the picture of the Virgin Mary and the Christ child would not be a disturbing image. But the picture of the crucifixion would be, because that is the theological point in which Islam and Christianity most radically diverge. That is, in Islam, there is no Trinity, there is no multiplicity of the divine. Jesus is a prophet, not divine, and so on. So you would know that a painting of the crucifixion is absolutely not Islamic, because that depiction would be blasphemous from an Islamic theological perspective. But you could expand that to say that a painting that individuates the spectators, the people in the painting, and is concerned with their emotional affect, that's not part of the Islamic tradition of depicting individuals, because generally it's stories that are depicted. And the way in which I interpret many of the manuscript paintings that accompany stories is that the paintings aren't individuating the characters so much as making a commentary on the story as such. That is, it's the story that's expressive and emotional, but it's not the figures themselves as individuals.
Over the course of the last couple of years, we've interviewed a bunch of people who are interested in and the subject of those interviews have been various, in particularly contemporary, and contemporary Arab artists as well as modern Arab artists. So, like, using somebody, let me think of somebody as like using the contemporary Syrian artist Marwan, or the modernist. I don't know how he would describe himself, but he passed away a few years ago. How can I look at one of his paintings and decidedly say whether, okay, this is or isn't Islamic art? Like, is there a rubric? Is there a framework that is easy to use that where somebody can come to those conclusions?
I mean, I think not really. I mean, it's a range, right? So, and all of us are subjects with multiple discursive frameworks. That is, when we're looking at a painting, we are already looking at a discursive framework that emerges from the European tradition, is participating in a globalized modernity, is also participating in local traditions. And if we're taking an Arab artist could be Christian, could be Jewish, could be Muslim, would be engaging both with, and also might have multiple ethnicities. And all of these are discursive fields that an artist or a writer might draw on in producing a work. So you could have a work that looks Islamic, that is, say, uses geometry in a particular way, but conceptually doesn't function in a way that articulates an Islamic thought. Conversely, you could have a representational image which articulates something Islamic. For example, there's a painting I like very much by Ali Reza Hoja, an Ottoman artist, which is a painting without any figures of a tray table that depicts the moment of breaking the fast. It's a very Islamic image. It's representational. It's non-figurative. It happens to be non-figurative. And it doesn't participate in the conventions of Islamic art that emerged between, let's say, the 10th century and the 19th century. It's not participating in that visual legacy, but it expresses an experience of being Muslim. So I think that within modern art, a lot of it has to do with how the artist is situating themselves. And there are also Western Christian artists who might engage with discursive fields that are Islamic, and their art might be Islamic, though they themselves are not Muslim. That is, in the same way that a Muslim can make a modernist painting that relies on the Christian tradition, the opposite is also possible. And I think the best way of thinking about this distinction between the cultural legacy and the faith legacy would be to think about the legacy of Zen Buddhism in modernist art. That is, after World War II, there's a Zen monk who goes to the United States, and he starts to teach at a art school in northern New York State, articulating a Japanese relationship with the world, which is distinct from how people were thinking about Japan during the war period. And that became very, very central to the modernism that emerged in that context. Are those works Zen? You know, my teacher was not a Zen Buddhist in ceramics, but there are elements of accident, non-control of the product. There are aspects of the object that are engaging with Zen philosophies. And so I think that it's complicated if one expects a theology or to be an identity or to be a strict affiliation. But actually, what gets really fun is that with all of these theologies, there's so much conversation between people and texts that even on the theological level, it's difficult to distinguish between religions. That becomes more of an issue of identity. And I think that especially in the modern period, we often think of religion less as how people are engaging with worlds of faith or the divine and so on, and more as identities. So I'm really interested in how these ways of describing and engaging with the divine translate into discursive fields, storytelling, visual practices, physical practices, and so on.
Interesting. Okay. What surprises you about people's responses to the book?
I think what's been interesting is there have been basically three types of responses. There are some people who've been very startled by it and take it as an affront, that it sort of undermines the premises of a universal art history. And I don't see why that's an affront, basically, because for me, there's no reason that one kind of art history should be universal. And it's exciting to wear different clothes and take on different ideas and engage with the world so that different discursive traditions can be part of our vocabulary of understanding the world. That in itself, for me, is a really exciting intellectual exercise, and it allows us to grow out of our horizons. So that's been one response. I think another response has been, okay, if we're not using the tools of art history, and if we imagine, say, objects to be transitional objects, what do we do with a museum? What do we do with the institutionalized aspect of art that no longer relies on these codes of art history? And so that's a really positive question for me, in that it allows us to rethink what are we doing in a space like a museum. And I think this is a question that's coming up all the time because museums are essentially technologies of the 19th century, and we're adapting them and readapting them to new technological environments. And one of the things I find really interesting is that once you bring in dream worlds, in a sense, you have a corollary to the virtual that's within the Islamic discursive frame. So there are a lot of possibilities of how one can rethink what we're doing. Another response, which has been very moving for me, is often by people who are younger than me, about at least 15 years, often people I know who are Turkish, who, like me, have felt alienated by the orthodox and conservative traditions of Islam that tend to be very vocal and don't see a place for themselves within that, but also don't want to be excluded from that spirituality. And I think that art history in general, as a field, emerged as a way of engaging with Christianity without being religiously Christian. That is, you can go to a church, admire your altarpiece, and you don't have to pray to it. Right? That's what a museum does. And the thing is that when you take an object from an Islamic context and put it in the museum, because it functions differently, the museum doesn't give you that same experience. And so I think that for a lot of people I've talked to, sort of having a space to think Islamically without necessarily practicing the social aspects or the religious aspects of Islam feels more connected. And especially coming from a Turkish background where secularism has been so dominant, particularly in urban centers for 2-3 generations, there's a sense of, okay, I'm secular, but secular of what? Because there really isn't a secular without a ghost behind it. And yeah, it's like, for me, it was like discovering my phantom limb and being able to feel my phantom limb. And I think that that's an experience that a lot of especially younger readers have articulated to me, and that's been very, very sweet.
Can I ask just like a basic question around categories? From your perspective, what are the baseline categories that constitute this broader definition of what Islamic art is?
I think that the best way I can answer it is that there are particular themes of presence and non-presence, objects that emerge in a story and then disappear, galleries that serve a certain function and then are not present, that emerge mostly in poetry. And it's that relationship with the object that I find the most interesting. One thing I should say is that because my book it started out really thinking about the issue of the image. Its original title was, of course, not the title that the publisher gave it. Its original title was, oh gosh, I can't, wait, hold on a second. Fortress of Form, Robber of Consciousness, which is a phrase that I borrowed from Victoria Holbrook's translation of Sheikh Ghalib, who wrote a poem called Beauty and Love, which is a commentary on the poetry of Jalaluddin Rumi. And so what fortress of form, robber of consciousness means, and maybe this is also an answer to your question, is that the more we allow form to situate us, the more it takes away our ability to have a broader consciousness. So form is something that gives, it's necessary, but it has to stay in a space that's transitional so that we can retain our consciousness. And so because I was starting out really thinking about what representation means in these contexts, the very important element that I didn't discuss in this book, and I hope to write about in future, is the way in which text functions. Because the most important form in the Islamic world is what one calls calligraphy in the Western world. I tend not to like the word calligraphy because I think khat means something else. It's a trace. It's a trace of a virtuous person. It is also a text that's already been pre-written that you are tracing. And that's a very, very different sensibility than calligraphy, in which you have beautiful grapheme, right? In which you're looking at the surface. And what that allows is that khat isn't necessarily there for an aesthetic beauty. It's not necessarily there to be read. It's a presence. And there's a lot that artists have explored in that presence that I hope to write about at another time, but that's not in this book. And that's an important thing that's missing, but mostly it's missing because I was thinking about the discussion of images and how one might think about images in ways other than those dominant in the modern European developed sensibility.
Yeah. So the art world has been criticized, I think appropriately, for talking about decolonizing museums and art history departments and stuff like that in words only. What do you think the actions would actually look like if we were truly to decolonize this? I mean, you talk about it in your book. So how could you decolonize art history if you're thinking about Islamic art history?
I mean, it's a really, really hard question because you're dealing not just with art and culture, you're dealing with capitalism. And so to me, the question of how to decolonize has everything to do with how a museum engages with the broader economy. So what's the function of museum? We tend to think about museums as being institutions that make culture available, but they do this through the transitional object, and those objects are kept outside of the market. In being kept outside of the market, those objects function like a gold standard for the market, right? And so when you're thinking about a museum, you can't think of it only as a cultural tool, but it also needs to be thought of as a material tool, as an economic tool. So that would be the first thing to keep in consideration. Secondly, a lot of the discussions about repatriation have to do with ownership, right? And the question is, how can you own an object in the present tense? And the object might be hundreds of years old, right? So what does it mean to own a heritage? And that's a tricky, tricky thing. That is, do the biological descendants of the people who own of the culture who own an object own it? Or do the people who are most interested in it own it? Or does the nation state that's on the land of the biological descendants own it? And does that nation state represent the people in that state? And then you have people who are displaced, like me, who are of mixed background, like me, and the place that we belong to isn't the same as the place of our heritage. And, I'm not going to up and turn German. I was born in the US. I didn't up and turn American, whatever that means. I'm not a lesser person because I don't belong to these places, but these places, these institutions also have my heritage. Today at the conference that's going on in Doha, Miriam Shatnawi made a very, very interesting argument in which she brought up cases from France and from Holland, in which she was talking about, when there are such huge migrant populations, what does it mean to identify heritage with the nation state? So, I'm not really answering your question in terms of what a decolonial museum is, but that the issues of repatriation have so many elements of capitalism and nationalism built in that they also don't answer the issues of decolonization. So for me, what is decoloniality would be enabling multiple stories to be told in multiple ways, to maybe have far fewer objects within a single story so that we don't have, from the beginning to the present, but maybe using 5 objects, an amount that's manageable, to tell an element of a culture that maybe isn't really a story about history or identity or religion, but maybe a multiplicity of stories that can be read in multiple ways. So if we're talking about, for example, I like to use the medium that I like to think of art in is the medium of poetry, because in much of the history of the Islamic world, people don't situate things in politics. They situate things in poetry. And I would even argue that as contemporary subjects, I don't tend to think of myself in relation to the political entity I live in. I tend to think of myself in relation to music and film and literature and all kinds of other things. And that's how I'd situate myself. So I find this situation of art in history, it tells one story. It doesn't tell every story. Situating an objects in poetry also doesn't tell every story. So I think that for me, a decolonial museum would take on the ability to put things in conversation through different ways of storytelling, some of which might still be political, some of which might be historical, might be trade-related, might be poetical, might be transcultural. I think for me, the decolonial really happens in this multiplicity, because this multiplicity reflects how complicated our identities and affiliations and discursive worlds have become in the contemporary and particularly the digital age.
You were talking about storytelling earlier. What are some of those stories that are compelling that you think people should know?
Well, there are a lot of stories that I trace through my book, but I'll start by telling the story of the painters. And there are different versions of this story. Before I tell that story, I'll tell another story. This is a story that's at the basis of Western understandings of art. And it's a story from ancient Greece. There are multiple versions of the story. This version that I'm going to tell is told by Pliny the Elder. And so he says that the painter Zeuxis invited the painter Parassus to a competition. He said, you paint something there, I'll paint something here. Let's see, and we'll have people judge what's the better painting. So they both set to work painting. And Zeuxis paints a beautiful grapevine. And some birds come and peck at it. And so everybody's just like, I even fooled the birds. So he says, so Parassus, what have you painted? And Parassus says, yeah, open the curtain. Show us what you've painted. And Parassus says, well, you might have fooled the birds, but I fooled a great artist. Because the curtain that Zeuxis is seeing is actually the painting by Parassus. Right? So what does that say? It tells us 2 things. One of them is art represents things by looking specific and accurate. Right? The other thing it says is art is by its nature deceptive, and it's an agreed upon deception. That is, we all know the game. We're part of the game. So being part of the game, which is what enables you into connoisseurship, and the ideal is to represent something perfectly. Okay, so there's a different competition between artists that is one of the rare parables that Al-Ghazali uses, and it reappears in several texts, including the work of Jalaluddin Rumi. So in this story, there's a king, And the king has two sets of artists. One of them is Greek, one of them is Chinese. And in different versions of the story, the Greek and the Chinese artists switch places. So it really has to do with the situation of the narrator of the story. So these two artists there's a competition between them, and the king is going to judge this competition. So they're each given a side of a vault, and there's a curtain drawn between them. And one side says, we need colors. They're given the best colors. They're busy painting. They're really, really busy. The other side doesn't take any colors, but they're really busy too. So eventually the side with the paints says, okay, we're done. And so they show their painting. The king looks at it. It's astounding. It's beautiful. It's shimmering. It's delightful. He says, okay. Other side, and they're like, we're done too. You pull the curtain. So note, there's a curtain again, right? And so they pull a curtain. What they see is something even more brilliant, even more scintillating, even more shining. Because what they've done is they've polished the stone so that it reflects the painting, and it's even more astounding than the first one. So what's going on here? One of them is a very amazing representation, right? It's the deception, the same as the deception in Zeuxis. But what we have when we pull away the curtain that's like the curtain of Paraisos is we have the polished wall, and the polished wall represents the polished mirror of the heart. Now, if you think about mirrors in that period, they're made of metal. And so they get rusted really easily. So what it means to polish the mirror of the heart is you're polishing that metal, or in this case, a stone surface, so that it has no flaws, so that it is clean of any damage of worldliness. And so that through the painting that's extremely beautiful, you don't care if it's deceptive. It's no longer deceptive. It's in another plane of the heart. And the plane of the heart can perceive its truth, the truth within it. And that's what's radiant. So our concern then isn't with figuration or non-figuration. It's in being able to use what's represented to perceive beyond it, not through the medium of the eyes, but through the perceptual medium of the polished heart. And so that polished heart is a central element of how you perceive the world. So in the case of how to look at art, if you're within an Islamic discursive frame, the things you would recognize are, of course, you'll recognize the Quran, which means that within poetic constructs, you'll recognize quotations of the Quran, you'll recognize commentaries on the Quran. And so you're in a discursive framework in which there's one book, the book from the divine, which is informing everything, which is the center of truth. And then you have many other works, which might be about casual stories. Some of them are even erotic stories or salacious stories. And yet they're also, at the same time, referring to this Quranic tradition and its interpretive tradition. And so, that's one story that's relatively easy to compare with the Western tradition, and also easy to see how they invite different ways of taking in the world.
Super interesting. Okay, before we wrap up, I just have another question about if you feel like this is a evolving category of art.
Do you mean Islamic art or the method of analysis?
No, Islamic art.
I think there are two different questions here. One of them is that I think that as a method of analysis, it's really important to look at the historical texts of any culture and think about how they invite reflection when one thinks transculturally. So in terms of Islamic art, I think, of course, it's an evolving category because there are people who are engaging with Islam as believers and also as the discursive field who are also making art. And it's an expressive tool. It's an emotive tool. It's an affective tool. Ultimately, any language is a tool. So maybe the easiest example I could give for this is that many people have written about geometry. And most of the time, there's been a general agreement that geometry is non-representational, it's decorative, it's ornamental. And Richard Eddinghausen, one of the founders of Islamic art history, offered that it solved a horror vacui, a fear of empty space. And the thing is that all these people who write about it as not having meaning, many of them sometimes say, it reminded me of music. And that's interesting, because it doesn't represent anything, but it spontaneously reminds everybody of the same thing, which means it seems to represent something, right? Even though it's not representational as such. And so within that, that's an open category, right? If you can use these forms to have an affect, I don't think it even matters if you think of yourself as doing something Islamic. I think that the meaning might be in the forms. And then for other people, it might be a way of expressing and articulating a relationship with the divine. But if it's the case that forms themselves can have agency, then it doesn't even have to do with the intellectual framework of the person making it or the person receiving it. And in terms of, that just blows up semiotics. But it also means that there's a lot of potential for artists to experiment within that space of affectivity. And that's just a commentary in relation to geometry. I would also want to think about the boundaries between real objects and dream objects. What does it mean if you can function within a world of a dream? What does it mean if time travel is possible? That is, you're dealing with alternative modes of reality, and that's what artists can deal with. Maybe artists are the best people to deal with that. So I think one of my hopes was in writing this, that artists always get a training in relation to the European legacy of art, right? One learns about that as sort of, this is what art has been, and now you go. And I wanted to have a different way of thinking about the world. So just like, Zen was given to artists and say, okay, add this to your collection of intellectual media. And this is also an intellectual medium. And so, that's also, it's another toolbox of thinking about how to engage with, our lives. And so in terms of decoloniality, my proposition is that decoloniality begins with our engaging with multiple worlds. And so that was one of my hopes. And of course, that's a process. It's not just me. It's multiple people writing about things like this, disagreeing about how to do it, and hopefully still liking each other at the end of all that disagreement. Because, it is important for us to be able to disagree and also respect each other.
Great. Before we wrap up, do you have any recommendations for books that folks should read?
Poetry.
Any recommendations?
Any recommendations? Offhand? Oh gosh, that I'm trying to think. I really like the translations that Michael Sells has done of the poetry of Ibn Arabi. I find that very, very valuable. I really like the translations also of the poetry of Ibn Arabi that Yasmin Seal, and I wish I could remember the name of the co-author, they did this wonderful thing in which they did independent translations of Ibn Arabi poems and then edited each other's poems and end up with completely different translations and languages, which just really keeps the poetry deeply, deeply alive. I would recommend Michael Cooperson's translation of Al-Hariri, in which he engages with the maqamat, each as through different legacies of English language, so tries to engage the literary form. There's so much. I would definitely recommend Christy Gruber's work on figural imagery. in terms of thinking about, yes, there were many paintings of the Prophet. Yes, there is lots of the religious imagery in Islam, and she does an amazing job tracing that all out. I would definitely recommend Margaret Graves' The Arts of Allusion, which deals with many topics similar to mine, specifically within issues of ceramics and craftsmanship and how meaning is produced in crafts and ceramics. There's so many good works. I'm trying to
Cool.
think. Yeah, there's so much. There's
Great.
so much out there.
That's super helpful. Well, Wendy, thanks so much. If anyone's interested in checking out the book, it's super easy to find. What is Islamic Art Between Religion and Perception? Thanks so much, Wendy.
Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure to talk to you.